Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying Deviant Off Script. We're having a lot of fun making these shows. And the episode you're going to hear today is with an interesting guy by the name of John Oler, who was a writer. He's a lot of things, honestly. He's a writer, he was a journalist, he was an attorney, he's written a number of books. And his latest book is actually called Gangster Hunters. And it looks at the early days and the early years of the FBI during the days of Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, sort of the 1930s gangster era. And it kind of maps out how the FBI came about. I think a lot of us have a vision in our heads, right, of what the FBI is like. It's a sort of undercover agent kind of operating in the shadows with an earpiece and sitting in a van doing surveillance, things like that. Wasn't always that way. It was sort of a operation that was run by a lot of more nerdy guys, number crunchers, accountants, things like that. So he gets into that and sort of how FBI agents were just guys that were recruited sort of in a different way. So here's our chat with John Oler. John Oler, thanks for being with us today. So when did becoming a writer and doing that full time and doing it in the crime universe, when did that all sort of come together for you?
There was this old cold case. I went to undergraduate at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio. An old cold case that had been reported on when I was at the student newspaper. I didn't actually work on that case at the time, but it was a big, well-known case, a murder case of a 14-year-old girl who was beaten to death in the woods behind a shopping center. And they arrested a mentally impaired man. He got a confession out of him, but it turned out he was not the guy. And the case went cold. I don't know why I remembered that case. It just came to me, and I started writing about it and investigating it and talking to the family of the victim and friends, etc. And ended up publishing a book. It was self-published, actually, an ebook, which I put out for free on the internet. And it went viral in the Columbus area. And it actually led to a reopening of the case by the Columbus police. And they eventually named a different killer from the one who was originally arrested. So that was my first real dive into true crime writing.
For the folks listening, this is the story of and the murder of Christie Lynn Mullins in 1975 in Columbus, Ohio. You mentioned that this is a story that you remember as a youngster, right?
As a college student, yeah.
I certainly, there's cases that growing up in Virginia, just outside of DC, there's a lot of cases I remember as a teenager that really are seared into your memory. Yeah. And so I'm curious from your standpoint, what was it like to pop open the lid on that case as an adult and kind of going back and exploring that story? What were some of the challenges you had turning over the rocks, so to speak, on a case that had long gone cold?
Really finding the people. I found the family fairly early on and got their cooperation. But then I ended up interviewing over 100 people from the community, from friends, relatives, law enforcement officers, journalists who had covered it at the time. It was really tracking those people down, which I did through a variety of means, Facebook and Ancestry.com. And it's still a way I find people through the internet. And I find that obituaries are a rich source of information for finding people.
You couldn't agree more.
You have a name of somebody, but you don't have much on them. You don't know where they live, but you find an obituary of their grandfather or something. And they'll usually list the person, so-and-so of Toledo, Ohio, and then you go from there. So that was a challenge. The other challenge was initially the police were adamantly opposed to reopening the investigation. It had been a real embarrassment to them back in the day, and they didn't want to revisit it. But the community pressure, and we had a community meeting where the people lobbied the police department to reopen the case, finally under pressure from the community. And after my book was published, the police said, okay, we're going to reopen the case and assign a detective to it, and who I fed a lot of information. So that was a challenge. And also some people that just didn't want to revisit their past. There was a drugs element to the story. This was the 70s in Columbus, Ohio. And I talked to a lot of people who, either they didn't remember those years because they were too high at the time, or they didn't care to talk about their past so much. Some people did. They said, I'll tell you anything you want. I just want the truth to get out about my friend Kristy, etc. So it was a mix of the two.
How difficult was it to balance trying to get cooperation with law enforcement, but also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but also your exploration of the crime in some ways is they're like, wait, it's probably going to not make us look great, right? So you're trying to get cooperation from the same agency that's probably going to not look great in the process.
Well, in fact, I got no cooperation from them, really. I never did. The detective they assigned was a good guy. He was a good detective, unlike the ones who were originally on the case. But I could give him information. I fed him information, but he couldn't tell me anything because it was an ongoing investigation at that point. And I think his appointment as the cold case investigator was not looked upon favorably by some people in the police department for that very reason, that they were embarrassed and did not want to admit that they had screwed up. But originally, even though most of the people who were involved back then were not still around, there were some, but still, was not a selling point for the. Although if they could reopen the case and solve it, that would be a feather in their cap. And so it ended up being that way for them. And they actually called a press conference and apologized to the family for having screwed up originally, apologized to the man that they had originally wrongly accused and put on trial, and they thanked me by name in the press conference. So that was gratifying.
Can you give us kind of the Reader's Digest version of the murder of Kristy, mm-hmm. what police had happened, and then what your reporting uncovered?
Christie Mullins was a 14-year-old girl about to enter high school. Back then, you didn't enter high school, at least in that city, Columbus, until you were sophomore age. And she had a friend who, according to the friend, and this has never been corroborated by anyone but the friend got a phone call from someone who claimed to be a disc jockey for a local radio station and said, hey, there's going to be a cheerleading contest behind the Woolco department store, which was a big shopping center department store in northern Columbus, at 1:30 or 1:45. And so the friend got Kristy and they went there, and there was no contest to be seen. The friend said she went inside the Woolco to check on the time, ask questions. She comes back, and Kristy isn't there. She's gone. The shoes are there that the friend had said, you keep my shoes while I go in. Never really understood why she took her shoes off to go inside. But so she's gone, and a couple hours later, she turns up dead, beaten in the woods, to a point that she couldn't even be recognized by her own mother at the morgue until she saw a birthmark on her leg, and that's how she identified her. But anyway, they had a sketch of the alleged killer that was provided by a man who was out, according to him and his wife, on a nature hike, and came across this guy swinging a board at the girl, and he reported it and gave a sketch. And so they arrested this guy who looked like the sketch. Turns out he was very low IQ, like 45 or 50 IQ. He confessed. They led him. He confessed. The confession got overturned, and he went to trial, was acquitted. And there were a lot of suspicions about maybe the guy who claimed to have seen him beating the girl maybe he was somehow involved. And that's who I fixated on as in my theory as to who had done it. And that was ultimately, the police agreed with that conclusion.
You mentioned that at that press conference that they had given you some acknowledgement of helping that case get resolved accurately.
Yeah, I left out an important thing. I think the thing that got the case reopened, because they were opposed to reopening the case. They just were immovable on this. But I got a phone call out of the blue from the niece of the man who had allegedly seen the killing, seen the other, and she basically told me that he had confessed to her many years ago that he was the killer, and everybody was afraid of him, so they didn't come forward. And so I reported that to the police, and they said, okay, that's new evidence. We have a family member saying that there'd been a confession. And then I found another family member who said he had confessed to her. It was actually his daughter. She called me, and I answered the phone, and she said, this is Judana. That was her name. I'd been trying to find her. She was a street person, couldn't find her. She called me because she had read the book. And the first words she said to me were, he did it, don't you? And so she gave the details on the confession. So faced with that new evidence, the police were forced to reopen the case.
It's interesting because I've worked in journalism for 20 years and largely in the true crime space. And I've always wondered what that would be like to have a conversation with somebody who has the information on a case that you're covering that can basically break it wide open.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, when you got these calls, this is inevitably going to change the entire narrative of this story, and you probably had an understanding of what this all meant. Can you talk to me a little bit about that moment when you realize I've got some info here that's probably going to change?
The first call from the niece was out of the blue, and I wasn't ready for it. But I talked her through it, and then I started thinking. I said, I better get this. I'd taken notes, but I better get this on tape. So I called her back and said, do you mind basically running through the story again on tape? And she said, sure. So she did. So then I had the tape, and that went to the police department, which was a lot more powerful than me just saying, hey, I got a call from this woman who said this and this and this. So yeah, I knew it was a groundbreaking moment in the case. Now, not everything she told me turns out to have held up entirely, but in particular, the family members disbelieved parts of her story. But I think the basic fact that it was her uncle, this guy, who had since died, that was important because he had recently died, and she had been afraid of snitching on him while he was still alive. But I knew that would break the case open, and it did.
And what was the reaction from police when you went to them with that recording?
What happened is I also supplied that to a local TV broadcaster, and they went with a big splash on TV about how there was new evidence in the case. And I think at that point, it helped that there was a new police commissioner in Columbus who had really no dog in this hunt in the old case. And I think felt, okay, we will at least reopen the case. No promises, but we'll assign a detective and get the public off our back, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating to have that kind of impact on a story, especially as you said, a story that you remember from your younger days.
Yeah.
And that probably had such a profound impact on a lot of people in your community, I imagine is a pretty powerful thing.
Yeah, well, I think first couple paragraphs of my book, I've mentioned how all of the friends of Kristy were in their 50s now and with children of their own. And yet this happened back when they were teenagers. And for them, it was a JFK assassination moment. They all remembered where they were when it happened. It stuck with them forever. And one of the interesting things was the whole process of memory and people who claim, oh, I remember it like it was yesterday, and I'm 99% sure this is exactly the way it happened. And in the meantime, I had come up with a document, a memo, which contradicted them. I said, well, it didn't, but so many people would insist, I don't care what it says. I know what happened. This is 40 years later. And I found that most people's memories 40 years later of the events, even if they were right there on the scene at the time, were maybe 50% good. The best of them were maybe 75 or 80%. And then some people were down in the 20% range.
Because you have people over the course of time build out the narrative of how things unfolded in their mind, and time really, especially 40 years, they start to convince themselves that that's how this occurred.
Yeah, because
it's not any kind of
they're remembering what they remember, or they're remembering what they read or were told or understood, as opposed to remembering the actual event. And it
becomes a composite almost.
Yes. Yeah. And I find that in my own life. If I try to think back so many times, The memory plays tricks on you. It just does. You think you were in a certain place at a certain time. It turns out, well, you weren't. You were there 3 years later or 5 years earlier. It's just, and those are for things that are vague in your mind. If it's something specific and galvanizing like this, it's and seared into your memory. It's still subject to question later.
And especially when trauma is associated with it, it becomes even more difficult.
Yeah.
But I wanted to obviously talk to you a little bit about your new book, Gangster Hunters. Gangster Hunters, How Hoover's G-Men Vanquished America's Deadliest Public Enemies. And before we get to how the book came about, let me start with this. Why are people so fascinated with the criminals of the 1930s?
Well, you might as well ask, why are people so fascinated with the kid who just shot the United Healthcare CEO? Yeah. And romanticized even to an extent. Because if you go back in time, the 1930s, it was the Depression, and banks in particular were the enemy, sort of like health insurers today, and among others. And the banker was the guy in the suit who knocked on your door with the foreclosure papers when you hadn't paid the mortgage on your farm or house. And so the criminals, most of these guys, began as bank robbers. Now, I'm not talking about the mafia, the mob, the big city mobsters. They dealt in stuff like prostitution, drugs, alcohol, counterfeiting, really big ticket items. These guys that I talk about in the book were more what I would call rural outlaws. They robbed banks in the countryside, in small towns where there wasn't a lot of security, maybe a couple cops with a 6-shooter or maybe a shotgun. And these criminals, they had Tommy guns. They had the Browning automatic rifle, or the BAR, which was Clyde Barrow's favorite weapon, which could cut through armor. And they just overwhelmed law enforcement in the beginning. And what attracted to me, a couple things about the FBI angle. The FBI, as I relate in the book, was really not much of an agency back then. It didn't have much to do, didn't have much jurisdiction. Robbing a bank, even of a federally chartered bank, was not a federal crime. Killing a federal officer was not a federal crime. Murder was not a federal crime. And so the FBI in those days, somewhat to Hoover's frustration, because he wanted to get into the game, but the FBI in those days was mostly tracked down white-collar crime, bank fraud, antitrust violations. And so the guys who joined the FBI at that time, mostly young guys, recently out of law school or accounting or business school, they were looking for a decent paying job in the Depression. A lot of them couldn't get jobs in law firms, even if they had a law degree. So they heard about this organization. It wasn't called the FBI then. It was the Division of Investigation. Later it was renamed the FBI. But they heard about this organization and said, hey, that sounds like a decent gig. And it pays pretty well. And I'm a lawyer or an accountant, and this seems right up my alley. It's like a desk job. I'll carry a briefcase and push papers. And then all of a sudden this criminal spree begins. And so you got these young guys. And so their boss suddenly shoves a Tommy gun in their hands and says, go out and find and capture or kill John Dillinger. And some of these guys had never fired a gun before. It's not what they signed up for. And surprisingly, almost to a man, they stuck with it. A lot of them might have said, particularly when some FBI agents started getting killed in action by these criminals, some of these young guys might well have said, hey, I didn't sign up for this. I'm out of here. Yeah. I'm going to go get a job with General Motors or whatever. But they didn't. They stuck with it, and they stumbled and bumbled around in the beginning, made a lot of mistakes. They were inexperienced. The criminals outgunned them. They had much more powerful weapons, faster cars, better plans. They were much more ruthless, the criminals, because many of them had committed murders. And they knew that if they got caught and sent to jail, the electric chair likely beckoned. That was fairly automatic back then compared to the death penalty today. And so they were not going to be taken alive. And so it was an iterative process of the FBI learning and adapting and getting better at their job. And they did over the course of 3 or 4 years and finally got all the men they were, and some of the women that they were after.
So where was the kind of impetus for, I'm going to write a book about the early years of the FBI and kind of this crew, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it was because most of the books that have been written about the gangster era of the 30s are about the gangsters themselves, and they're individual books. There's one on Dillinger.
Right.
There's many on Dillinger. There's many on Bonnie and Clyde, several on Pretty Boy Floyd, some on Machine Gun Kelly, some of these names that are colorful names. But
they're always colorful names.
Yes. but very few focused on the guys who were chasing them. And if they did, it was really Hoover.
Yep.
A little bit of Melvin Purvis, who's maybe the only FBI agent from that era who people today might have heard of other than Hoover. And that's really because he's been portrayed in the movies, most recently by Christian Bale in a terrible case of miscasting in the Johnny Depp movie Public Enemies a number of years ago.
Yeah.
But anyway, I wanted to take a look and bring to life and bring more focus onto the supporting cast under Hoover, the guys who did the legwork, who were on the lines and tracked down these criminals, sometimes at great personal sacrifice, including their own lives in a few cases, and sort of humanize them. And because they'd never gotten their due, and these are names that no one today would know. So it was a collective biography of that group of younger guys. Plus, there were some hardened veterans that I talk about too, that came from the Southwest, Oklahoma and Texas police departments to help out because they were marksmen and they were hired specifically as expert shooters.
There's a movie that I've always really, really liked, The Highwaymen, with Kevin Costner and Woody Harrelson.
Yes.
And I remember in that film, because Harrelson and Costner were playing the two Texas Rangers that were kind of in the hunt for Bonnie and Clyde. Right. And if I remember correctly, the portrayal of the FBI in that film was sort of what you're talking about, which was these kind of bumbling idiots who didn't really understand field work, and they were all just kind of like pushing pencils and smoking cigarettes back at the office.
Yeah.
Had no understanding of like how all this worked.
Right. They were tenderfoots, and they would flash a federal badge and the Texas Ranger would look at him and say, "Hey kid, let me tell you the way it really works." Now, the irony of that movie and the traditional stories about Bonnie and Clyde, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, is that there was a particular young FBI agent from Columbus, Ohio, named Leslie Kindell, who actually was credited by none other than Clyde Barrow's sister with being the key person who set up the ambush that finally killed Bonnie and Clyde. Now, he wasn't at that ambush for reasons that I go into the book, and I won't spoil that because it's an interesting kind of sexy story, which I'll let readers read for themselves. But he wasn't there at that moment, but he was instrumental in tracking down Bonnie and Clyde in Louisiana, not in Texas, where Frank Hamer, the Texas Ranger, had been spending most of his time. Hamer got a tip to come to Louisiana because we're hot on the trail of Bonnie and Clyde. So he went in there and tried to insinuate himself into the situation and told the local sheriff, "Don't pay any attention to those federal men. Let me handle it." And to his credit, the local sheriff developed a relationship with the young FBI guy and kept him in the loop. And so there's an untold, sort of an unsung hero of the Bonnie and Clyde story, other than Frank Hamer. Now, Frank Hamer obviously deserves a lot of the credit. He was there. He set up the physical ambush at the end. Right. But it was a joint effort. And in some arguments, the FBI played as greater a role than Hamer in the final denouement to that story.
I have been a long time sucker for any kind of media about Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah.
And if there's something on television or on a podcast or anywhere that I see it, I have to stop. And it's funny because I'm 45, was born in 79. So this is obviously way before my time, but I also don't think I'm very different from a lot of other people. And I'm curious from your standpoint, and we touched on this earlier, but like, why is it that Bonnie and Clyde specifically, like that is a story that people are drawn to nearly 100 years later?
Yeah. Why? A couple reasons. I think the main reason is that they were a couple. They were a romantic couple. And most of the criminals who I talk about in the book, from Dillinger to Pretty Boy Floyd. They had, in some cases, a wife, or in some cases, a girlfriend, a moll, who was there associating with them. But the woman, in most cases, was not herself a criminal, didn't shoot at people, was just along for a joyride. Again, depression, a lot of women had these, they worked in a soup kitchen or a diner, and which is what Bonnie Parker had done originally. And it was a dreary life at that time. And some guy comes and flashes a wad of cash and offers her a mink stole, and come along with me and we'll have some fun. And so most of the women were of that type. Bonnie, that was an element or aspect of her. She wanted excitement. She wanted to get out of the poverty-stricken area of Texas she grew up in. But she also shot at people, and that's been debated. She has a lot of defenders who said, no, she never actually pointed a weapon or shot at anyone. Now, it's true, she never killed anyone, but she did shoot at least a couple or three people, even before Clyde drew his gun. So I think that the lure of the romantic couple and the woman who was not just a sidekick, but was an active participant in either the Thelma or Louise half of the Clyde Barrow couple, except instead of two women, it was a man and a woman in this case. The other thing that you can't underestimate is those photographs that were unearthed. They left some undeveloped film in one of the safe houses that they had vacated during a raid. The film was developed, and then it showed this woman smoking a cigar with her foot on the fender of a powerful V8 and holding a gun, and then clowning around with Clyde Barrow, pointing a gun at him, and he's pointing at her. So, and those photos got splashed across the front page of every newspaper in the country, and that really brought them from very little known people to real prominence. They were only known in Texas initially. And the other thing is they really didn't knock off big banks the way Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd did. They knocked off grocery stores, filling stations. I don't think they ever made more than a couple $1,000 on any heist. And they killed, between Clyde and his associates, they killed like 13 people. 9 law enforcement officers and 4 or 5 innocent civilians. So that really made them famous. The public opinion did turn against them eventually after they killed a couple cops, one of whom was just about to get married. And so they were seen as ruthless, which they were. I mean, Clyde Barrow was not going to be taken alive.
I'm curious what it was like when you talked to, in your research, family or friends or people that knew them or had some connection to them, of like what their role is in the history of the FBI.
Yeah, I did talk to a lot of family members, children, grandchildren, grandnephews, and the like. Not too many people who directly knew the FBI men, because it's been almost 100 years. But you know, some of these people I talked to, they were a child or even a baby at the time. But they've heard the stories. In some cases, they have memorabilia. The stories get passed down, and some of it gets lost or a little garbled in the passing down. But they have the gist of it. And it was interesting. I wondered whether these people would freely talk, because in some cases, the FBI man I was asking them about had been portrayed, I don't know if unfavorably, but it had been as part of a screw up. They had botched rape. Right. And so would they be embarrassed to talk? No, they were not. They talked freely. They were proud of their ancestor. And what almost every one of them said is that you could not get these guys to talk about those days. You really had to prod them. And if you really pushed, you might get a little bit out of them, but they certainly didn't volunteer information. And I kind of likened it to somebody who was in the war, World War II. They saw so many horrible things and maybe did some things that they weren't necessarily proud of, atrocities or whatever. And some of the tactics the early FBI used were rough. They would rough up the criminal in interrogation, the famous third degree. Not always, but in some cases. And so all of the descendants said no, he never really talked about those years. I tried to get him to, and once in a while I could get him to say a few little things. But the people I talked to, they were certainly proud of their ancestors. And I think the guys who were there at the time were proud of what they accomplished, which what really was the birth of the modern FBI and the subduing of violent crimes in that era.
Well, I will end with this. What's something that I didn't ask you that you would have liked to have been asked? Is there anything left?
Other than what is the takeaway from the book? And I think we alluded to it a little bit. Yeah. My main takeaway is that fairly ordinary people sometimes can be thrown into extraordinary situations and accomplish extraordinary things. And that's really what this group of FBI agents did. As I said, they weren't looking to be heroes, but it was some people have heroism thrust upon them, and they accepted the challenge and succeeded. So that's kind of the theme of the book and the main takeaway in my mind. And it's not unique to FBI agents. It's in all different walks of life. You can find examples like that.
Well, yeah, and it's one thing that drew me to journalism and storytelling is the idea of when the extraordinary meets the ordinary and how the two kind of intersect.
Yeah.
John Oler, thank you so much. The book is Gangster Hunters, How Hoovers, G-Men, Vanquished America's Deadliest Public Enemies. I assume it is wherever books are sold. Is that correct?
and including on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, all the traditional sites.
All the things, right. Well, John, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you.